successful models.
Content about
one
more.
In partnership with the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency and other implementing partners, Helvetas is leading a regional, inclusive, and green economic development program in Eastern Europe, South Caucasus, and the Western Balkans. While designing the program, we've asked ourselves what a regional program would look like. We've been much more interested in the value addition of such a regional program than doing of the same initiatives that Helvetas has in different countries, be it in Albania, Kosovo, Serbia, or in Moldova. So for this episode, I've interviewed 3 experts who have experience in working for such regional programs or initiatives: Arnaldo Pellini, Gina Belle, and Harold Beckers. With me is Gina Belle, who is CEO of Chôra Foundation, a nonprofit based in the Netherlands, providing access to a strategic framework for system transformation. Chôra has worked extensively across sectors with leaders and organizations to take systemic perspectives on their challenges and design and manage portfolios that enable decision-making and commitment to transformative action in a world of rapidly increasing complexity. Gina brings deep experience leading teams and developing capability for system transformation. She started life in Australia and has since moved to Europe to expand the work of Chôra beyond the Asia Pacific, and has worked globally in the fields of financial services, nonprofit, and human and social development. Gina, thank you for joining.
Lovely to be here, Sabine.
With me is also Arnaldo Pellini, who is a co-founder of Capability, which is a Finnish consultancy that focuses on research and advice on the use of problem-driven and adaptive programming approaches to support complex democratic governance initiatives. Over the last 20 years, his research and advisory work has been in the areas of education and governance reforms, the ways different types of knowledge can help inform policy decisions, political economy analysis, and adaptive development, and the design of monitoring, evaluation, and learning systems that can help programs and projects to adapt continuously to local contexts and circumstances. Arnaldo has lived and worked for about 15 years in various countries in Southeast Asia. Arnaldo, thank you for being part of the episode.
Thank you so much for having me here. Great to be here.
So at the regional program RECONOMY, we identify and prioritize the sectors of economy and cross-cutting systems, which have more or less similar level of development and market relevant actors availability, stage of development of the supporting functions and rules, and potential for the employment opportunities of our target groups, which are women, youth, and the vulnerable groups. So what does regional value addition mean to you, Arnaldo, to start with you? Is it common issues, common actors, people who live in countries?
Thank you, Sabine. So it is part of that and includes those elements. I mean, to me, value addition, more generally speaking, starts when we speak about development initiatives, starts very much from the local or the national level, particularly when an initiative covers a number of countries or works across different countries. So it starts from that local national level and the political economy of inclusive economic development policies. What do I mean by that? That is important to ask questions such as, for example, who is more influential, which actor is more influential in terms of certain policy decision with regard to inclusive economic development policies, who is heard when policy debate so before policy formulation starts, and bring together different actors. And also, you know, who is not heard in those debates and maybe policy discussion, and why is that? So this question as to why, and a little bit the politics around the issues of inclusive economic development, I think are quite important. Why are they important? Because they help to understand why problems exist and persist in specific context. Political economy, as I mentioned, is a tool or a method, a research method that helps to understand those dynamics and brings politics at the center of the analysis, right? To generate ideas and designing activities or projects that matter for the local context. What the political economy with which I've worked now for a number of years maybe doesn't do that well. Yes, it brings the politics at the center, and that is very important and definitely a step forward over the last 10 years in terms of development initiative design. But sometimes it focuses too much on the politics, right? And the politics is only one element or one area of how economic system or inclusive economic system in this case work and operate. And therefore, it's important to also broaden a bit the view. So from the politics, also look at the system in the countries. But the system in the country don't exist in isolation, economic system. They exist within broader systems that maybe touch and cover in the region. So what I'm trying to say is that, you know, it's important, yes, to understand the local context, etc., but also then elevate, in a sense, the analysis and the view to the system's behavior at the country level, integrated in regional and wider system. And making that connection is definitely a key element of value addition.
And what about you, Gina? What's your take? What does regional value addition mean to you?
So to build on what Arnaldo said, I think from Chôra's perspective, you know, we would always ask, what can you do at that level of system that can't be done elsewhere? So really, what is the role that a region can play that's different from that of a country, or, you know, a village or a town, or a local area? And I think talking about systems, and I think we all know that the problems that we're trying to solve are complex social system problems. Really, what's at the heart of thinking about the value add that a region can bring is how can it help us then manage the complexity and uncertainty that comes with these problems. And really, for us, there's a few things that I would highlight there. So, you know, if we understand that we're working with complexity, we're really in the space of smart or emergent practice. There's no best practice that can guide us. And as Arnaldo has said, there's no amount of analysis or expertise by itself that can actually help us understand cause and effect and how to solve it in a simple way. And so if we accept that this is the nature of the problems that, you know, your program and all other development programs is working with, then that also tells us that we can't know today what the right solution is to those problems. And so there's a question there around what can we bring at a regional level as an organization or entity that's working there that can help take multiple perspectives on the problem and a particular regional one that might help us discover new solutions and create new possibilities in terms of policy and the ways that we take action there that wouldn't be apparent if we were working in a more siloed model of kind of, you know, things happen locally and things happen regionally. And so there's a few things that come to mind there in terms of the value add. You know, if we're talking about complex social system problems, we need to take multiple perspectives on those. And there's always aspects of a problem, irrespective of what it is, you know, gender, the economy, that a regional vantage point can really ask a question, what can we do at this level? What resources can we attract? What way can we make connections across and between problems that can't be done at the local level, but then that can create loops of intelligence generation and shared action that actually help us make sure that the actions we're taking at a local level are connected meaningfully to the actions at a regional level, so that we're all working together in a more concerted way to make decisions and invest in action in those complex systems that have effects that are more than the sum of the parts. And so I think in terms of regional value add, it really is about how can it play that connection, gap finding, interconnection role that isn't just about, what are the needs and sectors that are really prevalent in a region and in local areas, but how do we actually create feedback loops and flows between them? And from Chôra's perspective, use a portfolio approach, not just to take action that's trying to solve the problem immediately, but to actually discover and explore what we don't know about the problem and how to solve it, so that we ultimately find new ways to take shared action, make decisions, and commit to working together in a more dynamic, interconnected way.
And how does a development initiative contribute to this regional value addition? How to create a regional portfolio? Perhaps Gina or Arnaldo?
Happy to get us started there. So really there's two core processes that sit nested within an overall portfolio approach that Chôra brings to this space. And really there's two things there. There's how do you make sense of, take stock of what's currently being invested in the action that's being taken in a system. And then how do you actually design and make decisions about the new actions and investments that you make to actually solve problems? And so in terms of how might we think differently about the roles that development initiatives play, one thing that I would say is that I think the natural progression beyond talking about portfolio approaches and moving from single point to interconnected solutions is actually starting to think about a portfolio as an interconnected set of actions being a development initiative, rather than the things and parts and pieces in any sector or thematic area of action as the development initiatives. And so what I mean by that is that really what these portfolio approaches do and how they might help us make sense of what's happening in the system is ask a few fundamental questions. Why this set of activities, this set of investments of resources at this point in time? And how relevant and coherent is that with our intent, with the impact that we're trying to make? And not at the level of individual projects, but actually if we observe our entire portfolio of actions, what happens if we look at them and think about how are they connected and working together, and where are the gaps in those initiatives in terms of how they relate to that complex system and our understanding of the problem? And to do that, you really need to go back to first principles, almost around who are we as development actors in this space at either local or regional level, and do something which sounds self-explanatory, but we know that it doesn't matter whether you're a development organization or a corporate. Often we take for granted that there's a sense of a shared understanding of the problem, or a shared sense of our intent or the effects and impacts that we want to take. And so for development initiatives, whether it's single point solutions or a portfolio approach, as Arnaldo and I would posit that you should bring to these spaces, really the first step should be, well, who are we as development agents? What resources and intent are we bringing to this space? And therefore, what about this problem is relevant to us? And should we really be targeting and investing in both making what we're currently doing more interconnected and systemic in terms of the action it takes in the space and the effects that it produces, but also how can we use that more systemic understanding to make better decisions about how we expand or change and adapt that portfolio over time. So I'll pause there, but that's just to give a sense of how can we start to think about portfolios as a discovery mechanism for actually helping us better understand the problem and create almost a budget of possibilities for ourselves, new possibilities for action, for policy, for development initiatives, new models for solving problems that weren't there before, rather than a portfolio as something that we're plugging into solving the problem as a first step.
Arnaldo?
Yeah, just a couple of words to add on something that one of the things that Gina has just mentioned, which is particularly this cohesion, this coherence of the set of activities or intervention, right, towards vis-a-vis the intent and the problem, of course, that the initiative is trying to solve. And there is, and also linking to my answer earlier with regard to political economy, etc., and the analysis of the context, what portfolio sense making and working with portfolio, thinking portfolio, and also thinking system allows is also, in my opinion, to keep that analysis of the context and the politics and the of the problems, etc., alive throughout the process. So it's not a report that is produced at the beginning when the program is started. Yes, great analysis, etc., and then remains there and is not pick up. Because if you are constantly looking at the cohesion and the coherence of the activities, for example, in a regional initiative, then you can also constantly ask the question as to how the changes in context and circumstances are kind of influencing your portfolio, or is your portfolio actually contributing to changes or influencing change in context and the circumstances in which it operates. So I think it's another element of that cohesion, which is something I'm really learning from the work that Chôra is doing.
Mm-hmm. And do you know any regional initiative that has contributed to this regional value addition? Like, could you give an example, perhaps, Arnaldo?
I mean, there are several. I think development partners are trying these approaches, right? That value context specific intervention, like at the national level, but then also look at the possibility to influence policies, discourse, debate, if not programming, at the regional level. So there are not many, but there are. No, and one that I am involved with, particularly on the area of monitoring, evaluation, and learning, is called SPARK, is the acronym of the program. Is funded by the UK government, and SPARK stands for Supporting Pastoralism and Agriculture in Recurrent and Protracted Crisis. As a program, it's a 5-year program, as I said, funded by UK government, which aims at generating research in various forms, also evidence about local innovations, research about the problem that pastoralists and agriculture and farmers face, particularly in Eastern Africa and the Horn of Africa, so also in difficult and complex contexts or settings, and aims at informing policies primarily at the national level, as well as programming by country offices at the national level, but then ask the question as to what is the added value, or what is then the influence at the regional level from the different experiences that the program is able to involve with at the country level. And in doing so, there is also a discussion around the portfolio of work at the country, at the national level, and then the question about the cohesion and coherence of the whole portfolio. So the sum of the work at the national level, but something that is more the sum of its part. So that's one example that comes to my mind.
Gina?
So I think something that Chôra has been working a lot, particularly in development, is around how can we bring a value add to both regional or country level development programs by actually generating toolkits and methodologies that can be held at that regional or country level and localized in different areas, whether it be a city, village, town, or different particular countries within a region. And just to expand on that, so if we take tourism and cities, they're generally domain or problem based. And so tourism and cities right now are two particular spaces where it's been identified that you can almost go anywhere in the world, and cities as centers of really critical systemic transformation, particularly post-COVID, and tourism in terms of its criticality as part of the economy, particularly in a lot of developing nations. How can we actually create a regional value add toolkit that can actually create a useful representation of a problem like a city and for system transformation, and represent it in such a way that it almost says, irrespective of what city we're talking about in this region, there will be some similar structural features about this problem, about the social system elements that are critical towards us influencing the behavior of the system to create positive development dynamics. And so we really try to create these user-friendly toolkits that actually sit across, are held by regional teams, and then can be taken to any primary or secondary city in that space to help them then understand not the problem in all of its complexity, but just the particular aspects of the problem that any portfolio should really start to work with to try and get system effects happening. And we take that toolkit and we situate it at that local level and say, okay, well, all cities have commonalities, but then there's particular things locally that you need to breathe in and inject into that and really think about, well, what are the particular human experiences and resources in this space? And use that primarily to observe what's currently happening on the ground there and ask that question of coherence and relevance that Arnaldo touched on as well. But then to use that as a springboard to then design a new set of initiatives which are deliberately designed to work with that complexity of the problem. And so if you imagine that we're doing that in multiple cities, and we have one program that's European Union funded at the moment where we're doing that across the RBEC region, so Central Asia and Europe, where we're actually saying, on account of applying this toolkit, you get these, you can observe across those cities then, what are they learning about the problem that's common? And what are they learning that's idiosyncratic and can inform their decision making about that particular city? And then the regional value add is that because they're using these shared toolkits to explore the problem, set shared intent, and commit to action as a starting point, you can then imagine you can make sense at multiple layers, from individual cities, across cities, at regional level, and start to generate strategic intelligence that can inform decision-making from multiple vantage points that can help the action that we take to shift the system across the region and in there to actually work in a more deliberate and coordinated way. And really what the regional team can then do with those toolkits is almost take a helicopter view of what's emerging across this system and these different cities that can help us from a regional perspective attract different resources, take different strategic positions on how we need to think about cities, urban spaces and their role in development, but then create an interesting feedback loop and help cities themselves get smarter around working with complexity and develop their own capabilities to act in a more interconnected way in terms of how they approach solving these complex social system problems. So I think the value add there is really toolkits and capability development, but in terms of the sense making, it creates these layered, really deliberate and intentional feedback loops that can help any decision maker from the level of a project manager up to kind of the government and the formation of new policy, really have this shared kind of collective sense of what are we learning from our experiences in and across different places where we're taking these system transformation approaches.
Gina and Arnaldo, thank you very much indeed.
It was a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me or having us.
You're very welcome. Thank you so much.
With me is Harold Beckers, who is founder and director of Opportunities Unlimited BV. Harold is a specialist in market systems development and monitoring and results measurement. In 2011, he started the Market Development Facility and led its expansion into a unique multi-country facility active in 5 countries in Asia and the Pacific. Here, he championed a realistic interpretation of the MSD approach in thin markets. He also developed a new way of integrating women's economic empowerment into strategy and partnership design. Harold has lived and worked in more than 7 countries. Harold, thank you for being part of this episode.
Well, thank you for having me.
Now that you listen to Arnaldo and Gina, what they had to say about this regionality, what's your take? What's regional value addition to you?
Yeah, good question. I'm a real fan of regional programs, and I will explain in a moment why. But also I will start with an introduction in terms of what shaped our thinking about what MDF, the Market Development Facility, should be and should not be. When we started off the Market Development Facility as a regional program, actually in many countries where we first knocked on the door of the embassy and said hello, people were a bit skeptical. And that had to do with the fact that in their mind, in the past, they had seen regional programs, but regional programs then in a form of perhaps many countries, but then maybe one central office in one of those countries. In the other countries, maybe a very weak presence, a satellite office, or maybe nothing at all. And in their mind, that always had translated into, well, in reality, one center, one country really benefiting, and the other countries really not benefiting so much. So they were a bit skeptical about us as a regional program. And hence also we knew what we didn't want to be. We did not want to be a centralized program with one office in one of the countries and then sort of somehow pretending to be relevant for all five. We wanted to be extremely decentralized, but then with some centralized functions, and that I think also where the ultimate value addition lies into. Maybe first on how we were organized then. And that actually wasn't such a difficult step to take, because if you really want to think about systemic development, system is a fancy word for context. So what you do not want to be if you want to implement systemic development is to somehow have a uniform agenda. In each country in which you probably work in different systems. And even in countries where you work and happen to work in systems with the same name, we worked in tourism in Fiji and we worked in tourism in Timor. But tourism in Fiji is a well-developed industry. So you work there in a very different way in comparison to Timor, where tourism is very, very, very emerging. So we said, look, you need to be relevant in each country in which you work, pick the systems in which you want to intervene that are relevant to the country, work in those systems in a way that's relevant to each country. So that means basically across 5 countries, you get completely different portfolios. And that did generate much more buy-in at a local level. And hence also we were never aspiring, as one of the other contributors to the discussion mentioned, to have a very syncretic, organized portfolio. Because I think that the more you strive towards the fact that there needs to be the sum needs to be really more than the parts, the more you, I think, start to undermine this principle that you need to be first and foremost locally relevant, and because you start to push in things from sort of top down as opposed to working bottom up. So we were extremely decentralized, extremely diverse. Now, what does it leave? What kind of regional value add do you generate then? Well, I think there are 2 things that you can really add. One, of course, is even though you need to respect the diversity of the countries in which you're working, there could still be shared learning. You can still sort of learn something about doing tourism in Fiji that is super relevant for tourism in Timor. I think it's very hard to beforehand to define how much that can be, but the fact that you do work in tourism in a couple of countries does generate room for discussion. Hey, what are you doing? What am I doing? And I do think, in addition to that, there are maybe some topics that are really appropriate for sort of a regional supranational approach, but those probably are a few. In my view, the real value addition that MDF brought to its country programs was the fact that if you would launch a country program, you had to design the agenda in response to context, but the way of working, the way of operationalizing MSD and the skills to do so, those were already ingrained in the organization. So for me, the big advantage of a regional MDF as opposed to standalone country programs is the fact often you see new programs in a country starting off struggling to find their way. They're struggling to understand how to do analysis, how to apply a certain development methodology, struggling how to set up M&E systems, struggling to set up how to develop communication templates. If you can work under the umbrella of a regional program, which already has invented all those wheels, then your startup process is so much easier because you remain focused on what is locally relevant, but the tools to be able to sort of turn it into action, those are already present in the organization.
And also now that you've been mentioning, based on your experience in managing such a regional facility, how has the MDF contributed to this regional value addition?
Yeah. Well, I think as I said, I think probably our primary regional value addition would first lie in the fact that you had, I think, relatively smooth startup processes in all those countries. We were able to get a country up and running in a relatively short time frame with in a relatively predictable manner with relatively few hurdles that somehow tripped us up. So you get it from a donor point of view. I think you have an expansion apparatus that sort of has less risk in it than sort of launching individual programs one by one. And the second level of value addition, but I said that is really, that depends on the topics you work on, and sometimes it's more and sometimes it's less, actually I should mention two. One is indeed how if you work in agriculture in Fiji, and there are particular constraints that agriculture face if you work in a small Pacific island nation where agriculture needs to export it and needs to sort of deal with lots of complicated quarantine regulations. That learning can be relevant for some of the other island nations in the Pacific, for instance. So that is where you can extrapolate your learning from one locality and make it relevant for faster implementation in another country. And I think the third level related to that, but more in a thematic way, if you have, we did a lot of work on trying to make women's economic empowerment stronger. Now, if you can maybe almost experiment with that, pilot that in one country, and if it works, you can sort of rapidly roll it out in other countries. And on top of that, once you've rolled it out in a couple of different countries, I think, and you develop a certain evidence base, hey, this way of working works, I think also you become again more credible and meaningful in terms of your contribution to, say, discussions in the donor community or at the donor headquarters, because one pilot in one country is small, but if you do these pilots in 5 countries, then actually what you learn from that is richer, and hence is more interesting to inject into a discussion.
Harold, thanks very much indeed. A couple of fundamental factors will influence the success of RECONOMY in contributing to the regional value addition. First, managing a program as widespread as the 12 countries with teams spread across the region is not easy. While we work with strategic partners like Center for International Private Enterprise, Strategic Development Agency, Hilfe zu Selbsthilfe, Impact Foundation, Energy Efficiency Center in Georgia, and others, we are also putting in place management systems that keep up pace with the changes. Second, creating a shared understanding of development philosophy for sustainable and scalable impacts through facilitation is at the core of RECONOMY. The program stimulates changes for more facilitation roles in development organizations by engaging with local and regional conveners. 3 key areas characterize the regional nature of RECONOMY. One is thematic focus. So the national regional dynamics and nexus will serve the process of identifying and testing ideas that will add benefits to more countries in the region, new knowledge, shared experiences, and enhanced capacities through cooperation and a strong sense of shared interests. Second is institutional focus. While the region is diverse, it also shows common challenges and opportunities. So RECONOMY works to improve the vertical flow of information about economic development, including such questions as performance monitoring and inclusive benefits. The third is territorial focus. People don't live in the region, but in different countries. A large diversity of local partners and ideas at the micro, meso, and macro levels contributes to increased capacity and local ownership, as well as the generation of more innovative ideas. So RECONOMY does not directly support actors in the different systems, but it works through partners to facilitate solutions that have a high likelihood of ownership and scale beyond the lifespan of RECONOMY. Thank you for watching and listening, and stay tuned. This was Sabine at RECONOMY, a program of the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency implemented by Helvetas in Eastern Europe, South Caucasus, and the Western Balkans.